we who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak. Now, in the Greek, it doesn't actually say failings there. They translated, many translations have failings in the Greek there. And the reason that they put the word failings there is because they don't want it to sound redundant. But the actual Greek says this: we who are strong ought to bear with the weakness of the weak. So he's saying, those of you that are more mature, more spiritually sophisticated, ought not to be surprised when you find weak people in the church, and then it's your responsibility to help them. It's your responsibility to be kind to them. That's obvious what he's saying. The question here is, what is a weak person? How do you know if you're the strong person that ought to have patience, or you are actually in the weak category, causing others to have patience? In other words, here's the question we'd ask: what makes a mature Christian? What makes a deep Christian? A great, deep, everyone wants to be, I'm a deep Christian. What makes a deep Christian? Well, it's interesting. Paul never teaches that knowing different biblical languages makes you deeper. Paul never teaches that having degrees makes you deeper. Paul never teaches that having titles makes you deeper. Paul never preaches or teaches that having position makes you deeper. Knowing $3 theological words, according to the Apostle Paul, does not make you deeper. According to the Apostle Paul, in all of chapter 14 and now again in 15, what makes a Christian deep is if they don't argue. Deep and don't argue go together. Mature and resisting having futile arguments about stuff that doesn't matter. In other words, if you are dogmatic about disputable matters, and that's the key phrase in chapter 14. He says, do not fight about disputable matters. And it's such a brilliant phrase because it's very clear. It tells us exactly what to fight about and what not to fight about. He says, don't have fights about disputable matters. If you're having fights about disputable matters, then you are a weaker person. Now, you say, Kurt, we would never have fights about disputable matters here in Christianity in America in 2022. I mean, we would never have a fight over masks, for instance. What's a disputable matter? It's just exactly what it says. If it's indisputable, you stand firm, and if you have to, you stand up and you have the fight. Is Jesus Lord? Undisputable. Is the Bible inspired by God and good for correcting and teaching and rebuking and training and all sorts of righteousness? Undisputable. How do you know it's undisputable? It's main, it's plain, it's on every page. What does the fourth bowl of wrath in the 7 bowls of wrath in the book of Revelation mean? I don't know. If you have a dogmatic conviction about very disputable things, then let me give you an example of this. Back in the day when I worked with students, I would invite students to church, and I'd bring a lot of fraternity and sorority kids to church, and I'd bring them all to church. And I don't know if you ever remember this in the early 2000s when it got fashioned that college students just started wearing pajamas all the time. Do you remember this? Like they're in flannel pajamas. They looked homeless, just flannel Bali pajamas all the time. And I used to go to a church in Stockton where you wore a suit and tie, and the pastor used to teach. He'd say, listen, God wants you to bring your best to church, and so you polish your shoes and put on a suit, and don't come to church without a tie. You got to wear a suit and tie. And he had a dogmatic conviction about how you look. And so I'd have to always tell my students, listen, they have this extra biblical conviction that isn't in the Bible about suits. So you might look a little out of place if you come in your Winnie the Pooh flannel pajamas. Now, who was the weaker one here? Was it the non-Christian fraternity person? Or was it people holding on? Now listen, if you believe in wearing a suit to church because that's your personal conviction to give God your best, and you look good in a suit, God bless you, nothing wrong with that conviction, just not in the Bible. And when we insist on our dogmatic conviction be adopted by other people when it's not main or plain or on every page, when we insist on a disputed matter, we prove ourselves immature.